Hello, everyone. My name is Renee Willis. I'm with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and thank you so very much for joining today's Tenant Talk Live. Today, we are going to talk about responding to coronavirus, and today is Ask HUD. So as you can see, we have a lot of guests here. We're really excited about hopefully answering your questions about HUD and some of the regulations and policies that they've put in place to respond to the coronavirus. But as you know, Tenant Talk Live, it provides opportunities for residents to connect with the coalition and to connect with one another, to share best practices, and also to learn how to be more involved in influencing public policy, at least federal housing policy. So we are recording this webinar today, and we will certainly share it out with you via a link after the broadcast. And we may also have additional resources that we'll share with you as well in the link or in the email. So let's go ahead and get started. So on today's call, as I mentioned earlier, we have special guests here from HUD. But we're going to start with, and after the presentation too, let me not forget, we will also provide updates from staff. We have Ed Bramlick, who is the Senior Advisor with the Coalition, and Joey Lindstrom, who is the Field Director, who will provide you with updates on what's happening. But let's go ahead and get started with HUD. So I first want to turn it over to, and also to introduce Hunter Kurtz, who is the Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing. So Hunter, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I know that you're going to introduce your colleagues as well.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for having all of us here to discuss sort of the impact of COVID as it relates to affordable housing and public housing. First of all, these are some difficult times for all of us. We're facing truly two national crises. We're reeling as a nation from the death of Mr. Floyd, and now we are dealing with, at the same time, dealing with an international pandemic. And I want to thank everyone out there, the residents who have taken the time to participate in this Zoom meeting, as well as everyone from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for your hard work and dedication. We talk a lot about how important the work is that we do, and I say we, I include the residents there that are participating in this call and providing us the feedback. But it's always so important to be able to provide folks with safe, decent, and affordable housing. But it's incredibly important nowadays, and probably our work has never been more important than it is today, because we are, providing someone with housing is one of the easiest ways to address the coronavirus. And so I thank you for your hard work and dedication. So today we're going to be talking about a number of the things that we are working on here at HUD. We are going to discuss some of the initiatives we've taken. One of the ones that some of you may be aware of is we were given permission for the first time from Congress to do a very large waiver of a lot of our rules and regulations. This is the first time we in Public and Indian Housing have ever done anything like that, and I will be the first to admit, though I'm proud of the hard work and the speed at which we got it out, we've obviously missed things. We know we did from the, as soon as we began working on it. So forums like this are really helpful for us to be able to hear what maybe we need to add in another round that we're currently working on. So I look forward to the conversation. But joining us today are some of my colleagues from HUD. We have Danny Bastrash, one of my Deputy Assistant Secretaries, as well as Felicia Gaither, another Deputy Assistant Secretary, and then some other folks, Daniel Garcia, Todd Thomas, and Stephen Durham from my office in Public and Indian Housing. I believe there's someone from multifamily housing too, which I will let Renee, you introduce. So I'm going to turn the call over to Danny, but again, thank you all, and I look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts as we go forward here.
Great, thank you, Hunter. So the purpose of the call tonight, as Hunter said, is to talk about the guidance that HUD has put out during the pandemic that allows housing authorities to be more flexible in their administration of the public housing and voucher programs. We also want to be able to correct any misinformation, or, if you're not sure exactly what some of the language meant, and to also hear what you're thinking about in terms of future waivers or flexibilities we should be allowing. HUD is very aware that many of you are in high-risk categories, or you have family members that fall into high-risk categories. We know that coupled with job losses or income drops because of a reduction in hours, make it really, really difficult for you to support your family. And that includes not just putting food on the table, but also buying extras like masks, like other personal protective gear, like Clorox wipes and things like that. I mean, at the same time, HUD is also really aware of the fact that, and this really hasn't been publicized a lot, but many of you are essential workers. There's been a lot of focus about doctors and nurses working through this time, but we know that a significant number of you also fall within that category. Many of you are CNAs. Many of you are in the medical profession in other areas. Many of you work in maintenance or at grocery stores. And we consider you essential workers. And for that, we are truly, truly grateful for the work that you are doing. So now, to turn it over to the notice and what we want to talk about. I think our first goal when we were drafting this notice is to make sure that families stay safe and stably housed. Can't say that 5 times, but anyway, that is our first goal. And so in doing so, when Congress said, hey, we're going to pass this law, you get all these big flexibilities, this is going to be great, I know that many of you were thinking, what's the catch? And I'll tell you what the catch is. The catch is that we didn't have the ability to say, hey, you PHA need to do this, but you PHA over here need to do that. What we could do and what we did do is say, here's all the things, PHAs, that you can decide to do if you want. And this is like for the most part. You need to decide what's best based on what's going on in your community, based on things like what the rate of infection is, what social distancing measures are out there. You need to look around and sort of decide what you want to do. Which brings me to kind of my first point and my biggest point. In our guidance, we said that housing authorities, if you're going to do this, right? Like if you're going to change the program rules, you need to notify families and owners, if you're in the voucher program, of any changes that you're going to make that are going to affect you. Recently, we had a call with the advocates last week. We heard that, some PHAs might not be doing this to the extent that they need to be. And we plan on making corrections in our next round of guidance so that all PHAs are aware of this requirement and that you are notified when they adopt certain flexibilities. What we're going to do today is I'm going to turn it over to Felicia Gaither first, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Field Operations. So she is in charge of all of the field offices all over the country. She talks to them on a daily basis to find out what's happening in your community. From there, we're going to turn it over to different people to talk about really 4 different categories. One is going to be income recertifications. What should you do if you lose your job or if your income is otherwise reduced for any reason? Along those lines, we're going to talk about minimum rent and hardship exemptions. And then we're going to talk about HQS and the inspections for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And then finally, we're going to talk about eviction moratoriums, what it means, things that you can be doing, repayment agreements. So with that, I will turn it over to Felicia Gaither.
All right, thanks, Danny. Good evening, everyone. So as Danny has stated, I am responsible for the field offices across the country. So for many of you, you may not realize we have 44 field offices across the country who represent HUD and public and Indian housing. These are really the first points of contact for housing authorities, for you all, if you're not feeling that the housing authority is answering your questions, responding to your inquiries or concerns. So my staff deals with day-to-day operations. They keep me abreast so that I can in turn keep my Assistant Secretary, Hunter Kurtz, abreast of things that are going on on the ground. One, today I'm not going to take a lot of time, but I did want you all to know that we do have NPIH an Information Resource Center. And so if you do not know that you have a HUD field office in your local area, or if there's not one in your city, you can contact the PIH Information Resource Center, who can help you to be in contact with and connect with a HUD field office. So I'm going to give you the number to our, we call it our IRC. So it's 1-800-955-2232. And again, the field offices are able to answer any questions you have on the public housing, housing choice voucher program, or any of our public and Indian housing programs that are out in the community. So I will turn it over to Todd. I just wanted to take a few moments to say that. Thank you to the association for having us, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Felicia, and thank you to the Low Income Housing Coalition for having me on today. First, I want to echo the sentiments of what's been said so far about the challenges facing the country right now. You know, starting off this year with the pandemic, and now the challenges going on in the cities around the country. You know, I hope that everyone is able to stay safe, and you know, we will sort of as a country move through this. But my deepest concerns for everyone out there. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens for folks if they lose their job. We know that unemployment is on the increase, and that particularly impacts low-income families faster and harder than it does for other families across the country. So I want to talk a little bit about what's out there generally, what we did in the waiver notice to ensure that families are still being addressed when their incomes drop, and then talk a little bit about the minimum rent hardship, which I know there's varying levels of information out there, and I want to make sure that it's clear to folks what their rights are and what opportunities they have to the extent that they need support. So interim reexamination. So this happens when a family has a change in circumstances, whether that's income, family composition, something like that. But so we'll talk specifically related to if a family loses their job, they have a decrease in employment, maybe their hours get cut, they should immediately, as quickly as possible, reach out to their housing authority to let them know. It's critical for them to notify their housing authority so that their rents can be adjusted as quickly as possible. So right now I know that a number of housing authorities are in a variety of different statuses related to being open. Some are completely closed. I think now most of them are starting to sort of work their way back to being open. But some will have sort of online contacts that families can reach out to, reach out over the phone. Some can reach out in person, but it's important and most critical for families to reach out to their housing authority when and if they lose their employment. In the notice that we put out earlier this year in April, we provided some flexibility to housing authorities to help them address staffing needs during the pandemic. But the one thing we reiterated in that waiver notice was that housing authorities must continue to process interims for decreases in income as they always have. There is no flexibility given to not process those interim. And in fact, what we also did was to address the fact that housing authorities were in a variety of statuses of being open or closed. We said that housing authorities could accept tenant self-certifications of income changes as the sort of basis for adjusting rent. So knowing that the ability to sort of do the levels of verification that are out there are challenging for housing authorities, we basically said, you know, housing authorities, if somebody calls you and says, I lost my job, you can accept that statement from the family as evidence of the family's change. Again, housing authorities have to adopt that waiver in order to sort of move down that path. So when a family notifies a housing authority that their rents or that their income is dropped, the housing authority has to process the interim within a reasonable period of time. Generally, what that means is the interim would be processed effective the next month. However, if the interim happens sort of right towards the end of the month, it's possible that may not take place until the following month after that. But PHA policies will dictate exactly when and how that will happen. We understand that there are some housing authorities who have slightly different policies, a slightly longer period of time by which they go through that. But we are strongly encouraging housing authorities to process interims as quickly as possible after the family notifies them, so that families are able to get the relief that they need. That said, and so everybody is clear, rents are still due during the pandemic. Daniel Garcia will talk a little bit about the eviction moratorium and what that means in terms of rent payments, things like that. But rents that are charged are still due. So talking about now moving away from interims and that sort of process, moving on to hardship exemption. So as most folks know, in the public housing and voucher program, there's a maximum minimum rent, or the highest minimum rent that can be charged is $50. Housing authorities have the discretion to not charge a minimum rent at all, but their policy would determine exactly what the minimum rent is within their program. I believe in the multifamily program, the minimum rent is $25. So I'll let Toby sort of respond to any questions related to that. But what that means is that for some housing authorities, they've said that regardless of your sort of income level, there's a minimum rent of $50 or $25 or $10, depending on what the housing authority policy is set up. That said, there are circumstances where a family is experiencing a financial hardship where they would be exempt from or required to be exempt from the minimum rent payment. And so there are some very specific statutory circumstances which we've carried into our regulations, which said that if a family is experiencing one of the following, they would be exempt from the minimum rent for some period of time, either temporary, depending on the circumstances, or potentially permanent. These circumstances include if a family is lost or is waiting for eligibility for federal, state, or local assistance programs, if a family would be evicted when they are not able to pay the minimum rent, they have a decrease in income, including loss of employment, which prevents them from paying the minimum rent, if there's a death in the family, and sort of other circumstances as defined by the housing authority. So what that means. So when a family believes that they are not able to pay the minimum rent, they should reach out to their housing authority to request a hardship exemption. Immediately upon being notified of the hardship request, the family has a 90-day period by which they are in the public housing program not to be evicted. In the voucher program, rent is not due for that 90-day period. During that 90-day period, the housing authority will make a determination as to whether or not, A, the hardship exists and a qualifying event has taken place, and B, the duration of that hardship. So is it going to be a 6-month hardship, a 30-day hardship, or is it going to be a permanent hardship by which the family will not be charged minimum rent ever again? So once the housing authority makes that determination, then if it's going to be a sort of temporary hardship, the family would then be charged rent again based on those circumstances dating back to the date by which the hardship exemption kicked in. If it's a permanent hardship, the family would be exempt from paying the minimum rent moving forward. In the public housing program, if a family believes that the housing authority's determination that the hardship is temporary or that the family didn't have a qualifying event, they can file a grievance and enter in the grievance process within the public housing program to request a third party to review and make a determination about whether the housing authority correctly determined the minimum rent hardship. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm glad to answer questions during the Q&A session, but I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Durham, the director of the voucher program, to talk about HQS and the voucher program.
Hey, thanks, Todd. Thanks for that information on public housing. And as everybody is kind of leading off their comments about the current affairs going on in the country, I do echo those same sentiments. Interesting times we're living in, but, groups like this that are persevering, working together, focusing on the mission, trying to serve those that need it the most, kudos to all those involved. Thanks for the continued hard work, trying to serve our residents and make sure these programs are successful. As Todd was talking about interim recertifications and family changes in income that our families are impacted by on the voucher program, one of the things that is consistently an issue that our tenants and landlords alike are dealing with is the inspection process, the housing quality standards inspection process. And so what we've done through our portion of the waiver notice that came out in April is that we've allowed some flexibilities in that process to benefit both the tenant and the PHA, allowing a little bit more time for PHAs to schedule inspections, giving them the opportunity to prepare their staff to perform these inspections so that they have the proper equipment, protection equipment, if they are going into units, making sure that they're going to be able to sanitize pre and post the inspection. So a lot of the administrative flexibilities that our money that we put out, administrative funds, were allow PHAs to make these preparations and allow them to pursue new ways of doing inspections as well for the HQS program. So all that to say is that what we're trying to do is make sure that everybody's working together. The HQS process for our tenants at times can be invasive. It can be lengthy. And what we have done, like I said, is allowed some flexibilities so that everybody can understand the times that we're living in and make the necessary preparation. But of the utmost importance that we do want to convey is that, you know, the health and safety of the units is the most important thing that, you know, that we can ensure for our residents. And so by relaxing the timelines, that did not give PHAs the flexibility to not conduct inspections. The requirement still remains. And so what we would like to see is that our PHAs are taking some of these opportunities to move some of the flexibilities that we've afforded them previously and in the HOTMA Act, that allow PHAs to move to biennial inspections. We're looking to our small and rural PHAs to move to triennial inspections. Now, and these flexibilities are already available so that it helps everybody that's involved in the process. But those are things that we've also, within our notice, have laxed a bit. But one of the things that we did not touch in the waiver notice is eligibility for the program. And I think that's a big concern out there is, you know, people are, as their housing situations are changing, people are needing to make quick decisions, quick moves in with family. And so what, you know, our program does allow for our guests to participate and to reside in a household for short periods of time, generally governed by the PHA's administrative plan on how long that time can be prior to that family being added to the household composition. But what we've done in the space and security realm of HQS is allowed for some of those emergency move-ins to happen in additions to family composition that may in turn go against what our normal occupancy standard would call for, which would be 2 persons per sleeping room. If you have a household that is 2 bedrooms, you would expect to have 4 people in there, 3 to 4 people. Here's an option where somebody has to bring in a family member, a 5th person can now come in. And that provision is something that we have in place for a period of time where we would allow that to happen, but not to exceed 1 year from the date of the waiver notice, which would be the April 10th date, or to the end of the lease term. So at the end of the lease term, the family would then have to look for a unit to move that fits the right size. So what we're trying to do is give people flexibility, families flexibility. It is a time where, you know, everything is uncertain. And so we're trying to allow people to adjust for those changes in their lives, but still, you know, enforcing the basics of the program. As I did mention, it is the PHA's obligation to still conduct inspections. Our inspections that are commonly known as life-threatening, for life-threatening issues, require a 24-hour notice to the owner from the PHA, and the owner is required to go out there and make that repair. A part of that provision that we've relaxed is the notification to the PHA, allowing the owner to certify that they have fixed it, and then the PHA having a little bit longer time to get out there and verify that the actual life-threatening condition has been abated. So it doesn't absolve the owner of their responsibility to ensure that the unit is safe and is up to standard for the family, but it does give them the opportunity to certify that they have made some of those repairs. Once again, we're hoping that PHAs will not maximize the time, I should say, for these things, but instead find ways to perform these inspections, whether it be taking an interest in remote virtual inspections where they are able to conduct a inspection using a cell phone with the representative. That representative in some cases may be from the PHA or maybe it's the tenant. That's for the PHA to decide, but those are the types of things that we are hoping to happen out there. So there were 11 HQS waivers in total that were granted, some for our project-based voucher properties, allowing people to remain in units a little bit beyond the normal time period that a person would have to be removed from a unit if they were over income. So we're, like I said, we're not in the business of upsetting lives, but giving people some flexibility, a little bit more time to make adjustments. Some of these provisions end in October, others are end at end of the calendar year. We do reserve the right to extend some of these provisions and allow for some flexibilities to continue on. So what we're trying to do, like I said, is just make the program convenient for everybody in this new environment. And so those are the things that we're doing. You know, at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle Garcia so that she can talk to you guys about what's happening in the eviction space.
Hi, thanks, Stephen, and good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk through the eviction moratorium and really just what does that mean to you and what are your rights under the eviction moratorium that's in the CARES Act. So basically, the moratorium, it provides 120 days for evictions for non-payment of rent or charges, fees related to non-payment of rent. All of that has been temporarily suspended, and the time frame we're looking at is March 27th through July 24th. So basically, your landlord or PHA cannot charge you any late fees during this time. And this applies to all HUD assistance tenants. So for the purposes of this call, that means our public housing and your Section 8 programs, that's your voucher holders, as well as any resident within Toby's shop that I'm going to kick off to later in office multifamily. So Todd mentioned this earlier, and we do want to highlight it, is that the moratorium on evictions for non-payment of rent does not suspend your rent payments. So it's really important to remember that rent is still due at this time, and if you don't pay it, it's going to be accumulating come, at the end of July 24th. But there are great opportunities for you. So if you did lose your job, of course, please report that to the PHA, and we can certainly submit your interim re-exam and adjust your rent. That way we can reflect your rent in accordance with your actual income. So if there's any unpaid rent during the eviction suspension, then at the very end, July 24th, you have the option to either pay that in a lump sum because it's accumulated over time to avoid the eviction. You can also talk to your housing authority or the landlord and see if a repayment agreement would be an option. The PHA or the landlord can still terminate assistance and evict for other cases. That would be drug abuse, criminal activity, lease violations, etc. It's important to remember that the suspension of evictions only applies to non-payment of rent. So if you think that you're being wrongfully evicted, please reach out to your PHA or a local legal aid organization. You can certainly inform your landlord and PHA that the eviction is against the law if it's based on non-payment of rent between March 27th and July 24th. I also want to point out to also check out your state and local laws, as some are also enacting their own moratorium on evictions that may last longer than 120 days provided in the CARES Act. And I just want to close by saying there's this very helpful website that's available to you. It's from the Eviction Lab, and it pretty much outlines the states and localities that have implemented suspension on evictions and utility shutoffs. The website is evictionlab.org/COVID-19 eviction-policies / and it's really helpful. It outlines, you can look up your state, your jurisdiction, and just kind of take a look at what's been reported as a local eviction moratorium or utility shutoff. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to Toby Holliday. He is the director in the Office of Multifamily for the Office of Portfolio Asset Management Portfolio Oversight. Thanks.
Great, thanks Danielle. Thanks to the Low Income Housing Coalition and Renee and Joey and everyone else there for allowing us all to be part of this tenant talk this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Like everyone else, it's good to be able to be with all of you during what is obviously a very anxious and difficult time. We're all working as hard as we can to try and keep tenants safe and secure, but of course, we all have struggles to stay healthy and safe, even while our nation is struggling to ensure justice for people who are not getting the justice they deserve. So thanks to everyone for all your hard work. So as Danielle mentioned, I am here from the Office of Multifamily Housing. So I know a lot of folks on the phone are very familiar with these programs, but for those who are not, let me just provide a little bit of a context here. So in the Office of Public and Indian Housing, the folks that you've been hearing from so far is the Public Housing Program and the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Housing Choice Voucher Program in round terms provides HUD-assisted housing to about 2.5 million units through individual vouchers. The Public Housing Program provides about half that number, about 1.2 million units through public housing authorities. And then my office, the Office of Multifamily Housing Programs, provides a similar number, about 1.2 million units of affordable housing through privately owned properties, usually properties between 40, sometimes 100, sometimes well over 100 units that are receiving project-based rental assistance and supporting tenants in that way. So our programs are very similar to what you've heard from my colleagues at PIH. A lot of the programs and solutions that we've been working on during the COVID-19 emergency are very similar. We've been coordinating through Danielle and others in PIH to try and make our policies as seamless and consistent as possible, but there are some important differences I want to mention. And before I get into that, I want to just briefly mention that there is a website that you can use. I know a lot of folks are unsure about exactly what is the nature of the HUD assistance that they receive and what are the conditions that apply to the building that they're in. It's not always easy for an individual tenant to understand. So there is a resource on the web called the Hud Resource Locator, and I'm just going to read you the URL. It's resources.hud.gov, and that will launch a map that will help you to see if you can find your address on the map, and you're not a voucher holder. Most people understand if they're using an individual voucher, but it can help you to locate your building and understand which part of HUD it's supported by, which helps you to understand some of the policies that apply to that building and to your unit. So some of the things I want to mention just briefly. So like Public and Indian Housing, Office of Multifamily Housing has done a lot to focus on recertifications for tenants. So making it easier and simpler for tenants to go and if they've experienced a loss of income due to loss of hours, business shutdowns, or just stay-at-home orders, it's a lot simpler right now to connect with your landlord, explain your situation, and have your rent adjusted to reduce the tenant portion of your rent and increase the HUD portion of your rent to make it easier to stay in your unit. And as Danielle was just saying about eviction protections, those apply in very much the same way to the multifamily portfolio, the project-based rental assistance portfolio. Rent is still due, it still accumulates during this time. If it's possible to do so, focus on recertifying your income and try to stay up with your rent, because that rent will accumulate and it will still be due when that moratorium expires on July 24th. And as she mentioned, the moratorium only applies to non-payment of rent. So all other lease violations are still cause for eviction. So just beware of that. We have put out a tenant brochure that describes the eviction moratorium as it applies to multifamily properties. It also describes the recertification process and how you can engage in that without having to go into a leasing office, without having to provide an in-person signature. And that brochure also provides points of contact for who you can call if you're seeing problems with your properties. Steve talked a little bit about the suspension of inspections, and that's true on the multifamily side as well. And that's intended to keep tenants safe, property staff safe, and residents safe. But we also are very concerned about how property conditions can deteriorate during this time. So if you are aware of an issue at your property that needs attention, take a look at that tenant brochure, call your PBCA or other appropriate HUD contact, and let them know what's going on so that we can be aware of that and respond to it if appropriate. So both that brochure is available on the HUD multifamily website. If you just Google HUD multifamily, it'll take you right to our website, and you can find that tenant brochure on that landing page. Also on that landing page is a pretty good compendium of frequently asked questions that we've been receiving since the middle of March about how our policies are changing and other conditions that apply to project-based assisted properties during the coronavirus pandemic. We have been working through getting funding from Congress out to support these properties, to support tenants during this time. So the Office of Housing Programs received significant funding from Congress in the CARES Act that is now flowing directly to properties. Most of that funding will be going directly to offset tenant losses in income. So we expect that to be pretty significant across the portfolio. And so the recertification process that I talked about and that others have talked through really protects residents from loss of income, and that subsidy will flow directly to landlords to offset that so that they can continue to meet their obligations and pay their bills. We'll also be looking at other ways to support properties, support tenants and owners in dealing with things like the need for personal protective equipment, cleaning, and other issues like that. So stay tuned, we'll have more updates on that as things move forward. We're very mindful of the fact that while a lot of folks are facing uncertain conditions and certainly plenty of illness and concern about illness out in the properties, more than 80% of Americans still have not been exposed to the coronavirus. And so we're very mindful that there could still be some very difficult days ahead. So we're trying to prepare for that as well. So those are the high points of what I wanted to talk about today. So I can turn it back to Joey and Renee and see where they want to take it from here. Thanks again for the chance to join you today.
Awesome, thank you so much, Toby. So we're gonna open it up for Q&A. I think that some of you actually have already found the Q&A button. So at the bottom of your screen, if you're on the webinar, you'll see something that says Q&A. So you can certainly ask questions of our guest speakers there. And I know that a few questions have already come in. So why don't we go ahead and get started with those questions?
Sure. This is Joey from NLIHC. I'm monitoring the questions box. So put things in the Q&A box, as Renee mentioned, or in the chat box. And you can also let us know if you'd like to be unmuted to ask your question. I'll start out with a question from Limia El Shalzi. This is a question related to the timeliness of change in income documentation that was discussed earlier. And it's sort of a several-part question that I think I can condense into how confident HUD is at this point that property managers are aware of the new regulations for COVID-19, and especially the income changes and change of income documentation. This question indicates that they're seeing almost as much as a month for the documentation to be verified and for the changes to take place. Does HUD have time limits for how long those changes should take when property managers are reviewing them?
So I'm happy to jump in with a quick answer for multifamily, and then maybe my colleagues from PIH want to respond. So first of all, when a tenant reports a change in income, those changes in their income will be effective at the beginning of the month immediately following their change in income. So that happens automatically. So the sooner you get in there and make those changes in your income certification, the quicker they're going to get processed and put through. Obviously, landlords have been dealing with tenant recertifications for years. This is not new to them. They understand the process. What is new is to have so many people that are affected by changes in income all at once. And of course, property management staff are also dealing with concerns about safety and their families. So many properties are working with reduced staffs, and that may add to the backlog. But however long it takes to process that paperwork, those changes in income will still be effective at the same time, which is the month immediately following the change in income. And all of the private owners of PBRA assisted properties are familiar with these recertification processes. It's been part of their contracts for years. So they should not have any confusion about how this works. And the changes in processes, the way that we've made it easier for tenants to provide those recertifications have been available on our website. We've been pushing them out to owners. We've been pushing them out to the industry groups that owners belong to. So hopefully they're aware of those. We've certainly been doing everything we can to communicate those through multiple channels.
And I'll just draw a couple of distinctions for PIH programs. So in terms of when recertifications for interim decreases need to be processed, typically those happen the month following the reporting, but it could be a slightly longer period of time based on PHA policies and how quickly housing authorities are able to complete the process. As Toby mentioned, there's potentially a large backlog as we have a number of families who are coming in requesting this. And then I just also want to point out that in terms of the flexibilities, the self-certification, for example, that's at the discretion of the housing authority whether to adopt that policy. When they adopt it, that can help to sort of process, speed the process along and help them move through that. But not every housing authority has adopted those procedures. So for some housing authorities, they're still conducting business as it always has been in their programs. But just wanted to sort of draw those couple of distinctions for PIH program, public housing, and the voucher program.
Okay, great. Thank you for those detailed answers. We have a quick one coming in from Patricia Mendoza. Revised FAQs were issued on May 29th. Is there any estimated date when new PIH notice with additional waivers will be issued?
I'll take this one. So thank you for that question. We are already working on the second waiver notice, and we expect to have it published probably the end of June. It should be headed into clearance where all the other offices review it within the next week and a half, published by the end of June. That notice will contain not only a few new waivers, but it also takes a look at some of the existing waivers that end, like HQS, July 31st. And we're taking a look at extending some of them out because we recognize that in many, many, many communities, things are not yet back to status quo. We're also in the process, we know we just issued, we just issued our 4th round of FAQs. We're also working on FAQ round 5 right now as well. That's on roughly the same time frame.
Okay, thanks so much. I also have a question from David Nolman. What specific actions will HUD take to enforce its policies when it's found that PHAs or their property managers are in violation?
Oops, sorry, I was talking without unmuting myself. So I can start, and then Felicia, if you want to jump in and add. So basically, HUD has a lot of options available to it when PHAs violate some of our rules, regulations, or notices. HUD can choose to do a lot of things, or it can choose to do nothing. We don't have to take enforcement. We can choose to take enforcement actions. when it comes to property owners, and I'm just speaking now for public housing, and well, actually I'm speaking for the voucher program right now, and then Toby might want to add in for multifamily. But when it comes to owners on the voucher program, it's much more tricky. And HUD, you know, I've been at HUD and working on the voucher program for over 15 years. You know, there's been 10 to 20 that I'm aware of where HUD went in to take direct action against an owner that I heard about at the program level. And I think the basic reason for that is that HUD is not a party to the HAP contract. The HAP contract is signed between the family, the owner, and the PHA. So HUD can only step in under certain conditions. But again, as it relates to a housing authority, if we find out that a housing authority is violating policy, we can do things such as sanctions, which means that we could say that, hey, you don't get administrative fees for the voucher program for a month or two until it's fixed. We could recommend that, or we could require that staff go to training. We can put a housing authority on a corrective action plan, which lists a number of things that they need to do to come back into compliance. And let me turn it over to Felicia to see if she wants to add anything from the field office perspective.
Thanks, Danny. So Danny laid out a lot of our, I guess, options for if we are going to take some type of enforcement action. The other thing is the field office staff can get involved, and we will actually be monitoring. That's our role, monitoring and oversight. And so once we kind of get past the COVID and we get into the space where my staff is doing those reviews, whether remote or on-site, they will be looking at how the rule was enforced. And so if we find that there were issues that, you know, as Danny stated, there could be sanctions where we go and we say a housing authority has to repay funds back to HUD if they inappropriately administered the program. So there are some things, but as Danny stated, it's also the contract is between the family, the housing authority, and so we really depend on the housing authority to enforce the rules the way we put them out there. But you can always reach out to the field office and they're going to follow up with the PHA. And I will tell you, in most instances, when we start to make those inquiries, things usually start to turn around just from an inquiry being made by HUD.
So on the multifamily side, a lot of things pretty similar for us. We are dealing with 30,000 individual properties, most of which have separate landlords. So we're dealing with a highly distributed owner population here. Most are doing very well to manage their properties in difficult circumstances, and it's been a real challenge, but we hear good stories every day about how they're adapting to situations and keeping tenants safe. But of course, there are always some owners out there who are not doing what they should and not keeping up with the changing and our rules and the guidance of how they should be managing their properties. We do have a lot of options for dealing with property owners who are not following policies and not abiding by their HUD contracts and their FHA insurance agreements. Of course, there are lots of different ways that owners can run afoul of these rules, some much more serious than others. Our options are somewhat limited because of the nature of the relationship we have with these owners. Obviously, we'd like to hold owners accountable in a way that doesn't punish tenants or harm the tenants in the buildings. That can really be the challenge that we face sometimes. But we do take action against owners every month, every day, to hold them accountable for their obligations to HUD and to the tenants that they serve. And that's something that we take very seriously all the time, but especially right now when households are so vulnerable.
All right, thank you. No, go ahead.
Just want to add real quickly, sometimes it really is a matter of misinterpretation. And so enforcement doesn't have to go to the punitive side once there's the conversation around this is the way this rule should be implemented. That's all.
Great, thank you so much. We have several great questions in the chat box, so we're going to keep moving along. Question from Rachel Johnson is, what happens if a tenant is moving from a public housing property in the midst of a RAD conversion during COVID-19, and the tenant experiences medical issues and the housing authority delays processing the temporary voucher and the tenant still hasn't moved out all of their possessions. So can you give I mean, that's a very specific example. And so can you address maybe some of the specific nature of that, as well as talk about how the coronavirus relates to the rights and obligations of tenants who are moving due to a RAD conversion?
So I'm just going to answer that in very general terms. Obviously, there are a lot of different issues that might apply with the particular situation of the resident, the particular nature of the RAD conversion, but generally speaking, all of the rights and responsibilities of tenants and owners still apply during a RAD conversion during coronavirus. Office of Multifamily Housing is doing everything it can to keep tenants safe during this process, and in some cases has slowed some of these transactions to make sure that tenants are safe. It sounds like, you know, obviously individual tenants face individual challenges. Some may be related to COVID-19, some may be related to other illness or personal issues the tenant faces. So I would say it's probably best to work directly with your landlord, or if you're not getting resolution to your issues there, to contact HUD directly. Again, a lot of issues that could apply there, probably best to deal with those individually.
Okay, thanks, Toby. Another question is related to medical costs and rent calculations. Linda Soderstrom is asking about, can expenses for masks, gloves, bleach wipes, and other things that protect people from coronavirus infection now be included in the amount of medical expenses that are considered for rent purposes?
So this is not my area of best familiarity, but I would say we have not changed the rules about what qualifies as medical expenses during this period. So personal protective equipment, generally speaking, I believe does not qualify as a medical expense. Obviously, tenants need to do what they can to keep themselves safe, but the rules around medical expenses have not changed specifically as a result of the coronavirus.
And this is Todd. The same applies to both public housing and the voucher program. I would say that through the CARES Act, housing authorities were given some expanded uses of the CARES Act supplemental operating funds. And so they can use some of those supplemental operating funds to pay for PPE for staff and their residents to support them. But it is not an eligible expense for medical deductions, as Toby indicated.
Okay, thank you. Go right ahead.
Before you go back, just want to go back to the RAD related question. And so I would encourage that individual to actually reach out to their local field office just for some additional guidance around that, because that was such a specific question. Multifamily is represented in the field office as well as PIH, but definitely just to get some additional guidance to make sure that their assistance isn't at risk.
Okay, another question we have coming in from Daniela Pierre is, how does the information that's being shared today related to coronavirus impact HUD's family self-sufficiency program, if at all?
I'll just take that one. So it doesn't have an impact other than in the sense of probably, you know, some of the activities that were going on around the family self-sufficiency program, or some of well, basically the activities, they may be suspended right now, or they may not be doing some of those common gatherings for trainings, for classes and those types of things, but the funds still remain.
Okay, great. And now a question about the July 25th deadline, or the July 25th important date that was mentioned earlier. Will that be related to all rent paid in July, or just starting from July 25th?
Hi, so the moratorium ends on July 24th, so that just means that the owner cannot evict you. If there's unpaid rent starting July 25th, and that means that the owner or PHA can send you a notice to pay your rent and move forward with eviction. Now, the law in the CARES Act does have a stipulation that if there is an eviction due to non-payment of rent, it can't be until 30 days after the expiration. So you'll still have 30 days after July 24th before the move-out date would be. But in all instances, we really want to try to avoid that. So right now, process your interims, request a hardship exemption, try not to have your rent accumulate. So that way we don't have to, cross that bridge when it comes.
Thank you for pointing that out, Danielle Garcia. I think it's really important for folks to remember that an eviction moratorium is not rent cancellation. All tenants will owe their rent. They just can't be evicted for unpaid rent during the moratorium, but all of the rent will be owed. Okay, so next question. Let's see what we have in here. This is another pretty quick one. Will the housing quality standards for housing choice vouchers include guidance for remote video inspections?
That's something that we're working on right now. It's being piloted in a couple of areas. See how we can better fine tune it, but expect some guidance coming out on that shortly.
Okay, great. And another. Sorry, go ahead.
Back up for a second on the eviction moratorium. So all of the things that Danielle said apply to multifamily housing as well. That rent is still due, and evictions can be initiated on July 25th, but there's still a 30-day period where the evictions can't actually be effective for another 30 days. In addition, on the project-based assisted side and the FHA insured side, any resident who lives in a building that's receiving project-based assistance, or in a unit receiving project-based assistance, or a unit in a building with an FHA insured mortgage, there's an additional eviction moratorium that applies to those properties if they're in a mortgage forbearance program that applies to the FHA insurance premium that they receive. So that's an additional form of protection for residents who live in those buildings. And there will be some tools available soon for residents to be able to find out if they live in that circumstance. Again, that would just be in addition to the moratorium that's currently in effect till July 24th, but that's an additional protection that applies to tenants in those buildings.
Thank you so much for that answer. So I am going to now unmute Shalonda Rivers in Florida. She's an NLIHC board member as well as a board member of the National Alliance of HUD Tenants. Shalonda, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yes, can you all hear me?
We can.
Okay, perfect. Hi, Toby Holiday. This is Shalonda Rivers. I sort of had two questions, but I think for time's sake, I'll just ask one. I really wanted you to talk more or less about the hardship exemption on the multifamily side and the steps about it, or how to, take, but that was just one concern. But my main question is, I'm a grounds person. I be on the grounds, I'm outside, I'm in the office, if another property call me, I'm going over to the rescue. But however, my question is, with, major unsafe conditions during the coronavirus times, such as Cordova Courts and especially Glorietta Gardens Apartments in Opa-locka. I went there last week, myself, Civil Rights Agency, and another military service person that wanted to start doing community work. But however, due to the fact that there was horrible tropical storms down here, I went in several apartments at that complex where they were just all flooded out. And it concerns me because of the coronavirus and the sitting water. Day apartments, I got videoed, it was flooded out really, really bad. But my main question is, what is happening on, your side? Because Toby, I know you already know what's happening here. What is happening on your side? And when will HUD force, these owners out or to do major changes? And especially now during the coronavirus time, it scares me even more. So I just need to know, as you spoke a little bit earlier about what you all can enforce and what you can't force. So I'm just wanting to know, because there are major issues here. Today, there's a resident tell me she got feces sitting in her tub. It took the plumber hours to come. We should not be having this during these, more so, now in the coronavirus time. So I just need to know, or would like to know, what are you all doing? And I'm going to mute myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalonda.
Chris, it's good to hear from you. I totally agree that the tenants should never have to be dealing with those kinds of unsanitary, unsafe conditions in their units or in their properties. I know that you've been very active on a number of issues in your property and in neighboring properties, and you should continue to work with the HUD regional office in Jacksonville about those properties and those issues. And those are, there are a lot of issues there that we can't really get into on this call. But I would say in general, for the folks on this call, HUD is very concerned about conditions in properties. Some may be related to the emergency we're in. Some may be longstanding issues in the properties. But as I said earlier, tenants should definitely feel empowered to connect with HUD, connect with a performance-based contract administrator. And again, that contact information is all in the tenant brochure that's available on the HUD multifamily website. And let us know about those conditions so that we can follow up, because again, I would absolutely agree. Tenants should not have to be dealing with those sorts of situations during this time. Obviously, there are properties out there that have challenges, and we will continue to work on those properties to get those issues resolved as soon as we can.
Thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Shalonda. All right, so I'm going to do one last question for our assembled panel of HUD experts. And then it looks like we have maybe just a couple more questions that we're not going to get to due to time. And what we will attempt to do at NLIHC is provide answers for those questions and forward them along to our speakers so that any unanswered question can get a response and we can provide the best information possible. Yes, go ahead.
Right. Can I ask a question of you?
Oh,
would it be possible for you to send the questions to HUD afterwards? Because there's a number of questions here I think would be really helpful for us to include in our next round of FAQs.
Absolutely. I will send you a copy of the question and answer box, as well as a copy of the chat box, so that you will be able to see everything. Thanks for asking that question.
Thank you.
So I think the final question we're going to do live is a somewhat simple one, and one that I'm actually interested to hear about as well. Can a resident insist that repair personnel and workers who are inside their home wear gloves and masks while in the unit? This question comes from Linda, who says there's a repair person who prefers not to wear gloves and a mask. And is that an appropriate thing to insist upon during coronavirus?
Yeah, I'll take for the voucher program. And I would just say that, it is a person's home at the end of the day, and the person has to be willing to open up their home. And if they're asking for a certain courtesy, which we would hopefully the PHAs would be providing their staff with the PPE, the equipment necessary to protect themselves and to make that resident feel at ease. Hopefully the PHA is doing that. But ultimately, we ask for, on the voucher program, the tenant to do two things a year: recertify their income and participate in an HQS inspection. So that inspection is going to have to be conducted. We understand, we've given waivers, we've extended the period of time to allow for preparations to be made. We ask you to work with your PHAs and ensure that, you guys are both being safe. So, but ultimately an inspection will have to be performed.
And I would just add for the public housing program to that, the same would apply in terms of, it's a family's home. They certainly can make the request. In certain areas, I want to say in certain states, there are mandatory sort of mask requirements, things like that may apply as well. So, people should pay attention to the directives from their local and state governments in terms of, whether there are masks or other requirements associated with that people should be aware of.
Yeah. And I would just add, one of the things we are actually doing in PIH right now is preparing kind of some best practice guidance for PHAs, for our housing authorities, to be able to, especially when we think about COVID-19 as something that we're going to have to deal with for a while. And so social distancing, safety inspections, and having contact with residents, with their staff, just some best practice approaches to that. And so that being how to protect residents when inspectors are coming in or maintenance staff are coming in, as well as the maintenance staff and the inspector. So we are putting out some guidance to PHAs here on that.
And on the multifamily side, the same basic principles still apply. The resident is, it's their home. If a resident feels unsafe, they can absolutely decline to have maintenance staff enter their unit. We're not in a position to require maintenance staff to wear personal protective equipment, but residents, if they don't feel safe, they can ask that the maintenance staff not come into their unit. As Stephen said, the inspection protocols, we do need to get back to those in order to make sure the properties are safe and well maintained. As the last question indicated, that's something that's very important. But for now, our main concern is making sure that residents keep safe and feel safe in their units.
And I don't believe we've addressed that in any of our FAQs. We will go back and take a look, and if not, this will be in our next round of FAQs.
That's great. So thank you all for your really thoughtful answers, and thank you for joining us today. I know this has been a really productive conversation. I hope our attendees, and I know will join us in sharing that appreciation. And as I promised, we will share with you our questions box and our chat box. And we will now, Renee, I believe, turn it over to Ed Gramlich for an update on Section 3. Does that sound right?
That sounds exactly right. And again, thank you so very much to everyone at HUD. We really do appreciate your time and the information that you share with the residents. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Happiness.
Indeed.
And I want to extend my thanks to you all as well. It's been very, very helpful. I want to take just 2 minutes of your time because I know it's late, but I would like to take these couple of minutes to talk briefly about Section 3. I'm guessing a number of you were on Keith Swiney's May 22 Section 3 webinar. I frankly was confused by a very important part of Keith's webinar session. He repeated this a number of times. Keith said that in order to meet the quote unquote safe harbor benchmark in the proposed Section 3 rule, a PHA would have to replace its existing employees who meet that definition of Section 3 worker. They'd have to replace their existing staff with newly hired people who meet the definition of a Section 3 worker. That's not how I've been reading the proposed rule at all. I actually ran this by 2 very seasoned legal services attorneys, one of which actually worked in construction for a number of years. Both said that they also did not interpret the proposed rule the way that Keith did. And I really can't imagine HUD putting out a rule that would cause a PHA or CDBG grantees, for example, to fire people in order to hire new people to meet the Section 3 obligations under the 68 Act. So a lot of the residents in the Q&A were really scared about all of that. They were very concerned, and I think rightly so. I would just, from my own personal point of view, suggest that residents not worry about that for the time being. Let's wait for the final rule to come out, which should be sometime probably this summer, maybe the end of summer, and wait to see what that final rule actually says. And I'm sure there will be a lot of HUD guidance about what's in the rule and what the real impacts might be. So I just want to get that out there so that people aren't freaking out as much as I kind of freaked out during that webinar. That's it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Ed. And then I think the last thing on our agenda is I am going to wrap it up with just some reminders and a little note on how to take action. Right now, with a lot of housing funding at stake in the HEROES Act that's been passed by the House of Representatives and that the Senate will likely be taking up in the coming weeks. First, a reminder, Tenant Talk, the publication, the hard copy publication, will be finished in the coming days and hitting your mailboxes, I would say probably within the next 2 weeks. So be on the lookout for that. It is, of course, related to coronavirus and has a lot of update articles on what local communities and local advocates are doing to confront coronavirus and make sure that the housing needs of extremely low-income renters are being met. But as you all know, in order to make sure we don't have a wave of evictions as a result of the coronavirus recession, and in order to make sure that the service providers who are relied upon by extremely low-income people in communities throughout America have the resources they need to do their jobs effectively, Congress needs to take action to provide more funding and to pass new policies. We at NLIHC have been happy that our top 3 priorities in the next spending package are included in the HEROES Act. Our messaging for people is not to go out and pass the HEROES Act. There's a lot in there that we don't really have a position on. But our message is specific to whatever the next spending package is, it should include the housing elements of the HEROES Act. Specifically, the top 3 priorities for NLIHC have been $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, which is an amount that our research team has found is likely what will be needed as a result of the unemployment and loss of income. We're also asking for an additional $11.5 billion in emergency solutions grant ESG funding that many of you know goes to homeless service providers throughout the country and will allow them to expand capacity in order to meet the needs of people who are homeless and who might need to be quarantined or sheltering in place and breaking up congregate shelter as often as possible. And then, of course, the HEROES Act included a comprehensive national moratorium on evictions so that people don't need to rely on their local government or their state government to have an eviction moratorium. This would be a uniform and not a patchwork moratorium for all renters. And that's currently included in the bill. In addition to those 3 top priorities, there are funding boosts for many of the housing programs, both through HUD and USDA, that many of you attending this call rely on and many of the people in your networks rely on. So we're very eager to see that the housing elements of this piece of legislation pass very soon. I am going to share my screen, and I will hope to not have any technological problems here. So fingers crossed. Let's see. All right. No, it doesn't look like that has worked so far. All right. So hopefully everyone is seeing a page on my screen that says, tell your senators to ensure housing stability during and after COVID-19 pandemic. This is a link on our website that you can get to very easily. And you would simply put in your name, address, phone number, and then there's a pre-populated message for you to fill out that will go to your senators once you get to the bottom and hit send. Of course, we encourage you to alter and add to this suggested text to make the language yours so that it tells your story. We put this in as a starting point and we encourage you to add to it however you prefer to do so. So that's how you can take action as an individual. If you are representing an organization, we really hope you'll consider signing on to 2 different organizational sign-on letters. One is on the ask I was referring to earlier, which is to urge the Senate to act on the critical housing investments of the HEROES Act. But the first is specific to the $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. This is an idea that very encouragingly is picking up a lot of traction recently, and we believe that with more members of Congress supporting the bill in the House and the Senate, it'll have a better chance of being included in a final package. So we also have a sign-on letter that is specific to the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act. Organizations that fill out this form will have their organization added to letters. And if you want to read either letter, you can just click on them on the link in the page. So that's one way you can take action as an organization. If you want additional information, of course, at NLIHC's coronavirus page, which you can get to very easily through nlihc.org, you'll see that we have various fact sheets and various materials, and that among them are included our high priority policy asks for what should be in the next spending package. Finally, after you've sent a letter to your senators through our email template and gotten your organizations to sign on to the sign-on letter, you might want to participate in our social media campaigns using the hashtag #RentReliefNow. You'll see that various members of Congress, service providers throughout the country are tweeting with our infographics about the need for rent relief and the need for $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. So finally, I just wanted to show, oh, I think that was actually it. Here's the Eviction Lab Resource that was mentioned earlier in the call. Please note that on the Eviction Lab Resource, you can click any given state, and it will show you about the eviction moratorium and the electron shutoff moratoriums and where you can get information and so forth. And I believe that is, nope, I was about to say my final update. I have one more. Everyone should be aware that on tomorrow's national call for NLIHC and interventions on coronavirus, we are honored that our first speaker will be, in fact, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And so you can join that call at 2:30 p.m. The link to do so is on NLIHC's webpage. Right on this site, if you go to work groups and calls, you will see that we have information on the upcoming Monday calls. And we, of course, rescheduled this one for Tuesday to accommodate Speaker Pelosi, and we're grateful to have her there as well. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think that's the end of my updates. Renee, have we reached the end of our agenda?
We have definitely reached the end of the agenda. And Joey, you have a lot of tabs across your screen. You really do.
Yeah.
But again, thank you so very much to our guests who participated today. We really appreciate your time. Thank you to my colleagues as well who were here. And thank you to you, the residents, and everyone who attended and participated in this. We will have our next Tenant Talk Live on June the 15th, which is 2 weeks from now. It will be at 6 o'clock. So we'll send information out to you via email, and we'll also send a link to this recording to you as well. Take care, everyone, and be safe.